I showed up at my aunt's place on a calm afternoon, the sky a soft, muted blue with clouds lazily drifting by. My bag hung over my shoulder, its weight a subtle reminder of the trip I'd just finished. As I stepped onto the porch, a weird mix of excitement and unease hit me, though I couldn't quite figure out why. Before I could even knock, the door swung open, and there she was, her warm, familiar smile greeting me right away. But behind that smile, I could sense something deeper, something unspoken. You know, looking back, I should have trusted that gut feeling. But hey, hindsight's always 20/20, right? The house smelled like freshly brewed tea, the comforting aroma mixing with the faint scent of jasmine wafting in through the open windows. Somewhere inside, a soft melody played, floating through the air like a whispered secret. Everything about the place felt welcoming, but there was also this strange stillness, like time itself had decided to take a nap. My uncle, as usual, was away for work, leaving just the two of us in that big, empty house. She ushered me inside with this enthusiasm that felt both genuine and calculated. Her delicate fingers rested lightly on my arm as she led me to the guest room. As we walked, she chatted about how much she'd been looking forward to my visit, how nice it was to have company again. Her voice had this natural warmth, an easy grace that made the house feel a little less lonely, at least for a moment. There was something effortlessly elegant about her, the way she moved, the way she spoke. She'd always been like that, but now, in the quiet of the house, it stood out more. The first few days passed without much happening, settling into a rhythm that felt comfortable but also kind of fragile, like we were both tiptoeing around something neither of us wanted to say. Morning started with tea on the veranda, the steam curling into the crisp air as we sat in silence or made small talk. Afternoons were spent reading or wandering through the garden, the crunch of gravel under our feet the only sound breaking the quiet. In the evenings, she'd talk about her life, her marriage, and the silence that had slowly taken over it. She never outright complained, but her words carried this ache that was impossible to miss. She spoke about my uncle with a kind of distant fondness, like she was remembering a memory instead of describing her present. He's a good man, she told me, responsible and hardworking. But his long hours and focus on work have turned our marriage into something functional, not intimate. She laughed, but it was one of those laughs that didn't reach her eyes. We talk, she admitted, but only about the necessary things, what to buy for the house, when he's coming home, whether the bills have been paid. Nothing more. I found myself listening more than speaking, taking in the weight of her words, the loneliness woven into them. It hit me then, maybe I was the only person she felt safe enough to share these thoughts with. I wasn't sure if she expected me to say something, to offer advice or comfort, but I didn't. Instead, I just sat with her in that quiet understanding, letting her words hang in the air between us. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about her. What did it feel like to live in a home that had once been full of love but had now become just an echo of what it used to be? A place where conversations had shrunk down to the bare necessities, where companionship had turned into routine? The thought unsettled me, sticking with me even as I finally drifted off to sleep. As the days went on, I started noticing little things, small, almost imperceptible shifts in her behavior. The way she'd look at me during our conversations, her gaze lingering just a second too long, like she was searching for something in my expression. The way she'd absent-mindedly tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a slow, graceful motion that seemed natural but also deliberate. At first, I brushed it off. She was my aunt, after all. I was probably reading too much into it. But beneath the surface, something had started to stir in me, a faint, unnameable feeling, like a whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be ignored. One evening, we sat on the patio, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. She handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent an unexpected jolt through me. I looked up, and for the first time, I noticed the way her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something but decided against it. The air between us grew heavy, thick with something unspoken. I cleared my throat, trying to break the tension. "Do you ever think about traveling?" I asked, desperate to change the subject. She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I used to," she said softly. "Before marriage, I had dreams of seeing the world. But now," she exhaled, her eyes on the horizon. "Life has a way of changing you." There was something deeply personal about that statement, like she was revealing more than just her abandoned dreams. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her she still had time, but I wasn't sure if that was what she needed to hear. The days kept rolling by, but the dynamic between us had definitely shifted. We grew more comfortable with each other, but there was this invisible tension hanging in the air. She started sharing more stories about her youth, her regrets, the things she wished she'd done differently. In return, I listened, giving her the attention she'd been craving. Then came the night of the power outage. The house plunged into darkness, and she lit a few candles, their flickering glow casting shadows on the walls. We sat on the living room couch, the only sounds being the occasional crackle of the candles and the distant hum of crickets outside. "It's strange," she murmured, staring into the flame, "how some moments feel heavier than others." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if she could see me in the dim light. The weight of the moment settled in, thick and unrelenting. I could hear my own heartbeat, a steady drum against my ribs. She turned to me, her face lit by the soft glow of the candles. "Are you happy?" she asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "I think so," I answered after a pause. "At least, I try to be." She smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. "That's good," she said softly. "Never stop trying." A silence stretched between us, charged with an energy I couldn't name. I wanted to say something to break whatever was happening, but words felt inadequate. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt completely out of my depth. Something inside me shifted that night, something that blurred the lines I'd been so careful to keep in place. As I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, every glance, every pause, every breath. I told myself it was nothing, just two lonely people sharing a conversation. But deep down, I knew better. Funny how we lie to ourselves, isn't it? We'll twist reality into knots just to avoid facing the truth. The days that followed carried this unspoken awareness between us. We still shared meals, conversations, and even moments of laughter, but there was this invisible thread pulling us towards something neither of us wanted to admit. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it, that I was misreading the situation, but the weight of it was impossible to ignore. One evening, the air was unusually warm. She'd made dinner, and we sat across from each other in what should have been a comfortable silence. When we both reached for the water jug at the same time, our hands brushed, longer this time, lingering just enough for both of us to notice. She didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. A quiet tension settled over us, fragile and dangerous. She exhaled sharply and finally withdrew her hand, looking away like she'd just realized what that moment meant. I forced myself to focus on my plate, chewing mechanically, pretending nothing had happened. But something had happened, and there was no going back now. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room, flipping through channels without really watching. She walked in holding 2 glasses of juice. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, sitting beside me. I shook my head. "Just not tired." We sipped our drinks in silence, the faint glow of the TV casting soft shadows on her face, making her features look even more delicate. She sighed, placing her glass on the table. "Do you ever feel like life isn't what you expected it to be?" I turned to her, catching the slight tremble in her voice. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," I replied. She let out a bitter chuckle. "I had so many dreams, you know. So many things I thought I'd do before I got married. But then life just moved too fast. And now I don't even recognize myself." There was something raw in her tone, something that made my chest tighten. I wanted to tell her she wasn't alone, that she still had time to chase the things she wanted. But before I could speak, she looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. "Do you ever wonder how different things could be if just one choice was made differently?" Her words felt heavier than they should have. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening around the glass. "I try not to think about it," I said. She gave me a sad smile. "I think about it all the time." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken thoughts. The air felt warmer, the space between us smaller. And then, as if drawn by something neither of us could control, she leaned in, just slightly, hesitating for a brief second before closing the distance. Her lips were soft, hesitant, yet filled with an urgency that sent a shock through my entire body. For a moment, I froze, caught between reason and instinct. Then, just as suddenly, reality crashed over me. I pulled back, breathless, my heart pounding against my ribs. She looked at me, her face a mix of emotions, regret, confusion, longing. She started to speak, but her voice faltered. I stood abruptly, my mind racing. This isn't right." She closed her eyes for a moment, like she was trying to compose herself. When she opened them again, they were filled with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. The weight of the moment was unbearable. I needed to leave the room, needed air, needed space to think. I turned away, my pulse still racing, and walked to my bedroom without another word. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything in an endless loop. I told myself it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was the culmination of unspoken words, suppressed emotions, and a loneliness that had been building for days. The next morning, the house felt different. She avoided my gaze, moving through the kitchen with forced casualness. I tried to act normal, but every interaction felt strange, every glance a reminder of what had happened. She placed a cup of tea in front of me, her hands trembling slightly. "I think it's best if we forget about last night," she said quietly. I nodded, though the words felt hollow. Yeah. But forgetting wasn't as easy as saying it out loud. The guilt gnawed at me, an unbearable weight pressing down on my chest. My uncle's voice echoed in my head, his trust, his kindness. He'd welcomed me into his home, and I'd betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The next few days were torturous. Every time we were in the same room, the air felt thick with tension. The unspoken agreement to act normal only made things worse. She still smiled, still carried on with her daily routines, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. One evening, just as I thought things were beginning to settle, her phone rang. I watched as she answered, her voice suddenly brighter, more affectionate. "Yes, I miss you too," she said softly, her laughter light and effortless. Something in my chest twisted painfully. I realized then that she'd effortlessly slipped back into her role, as if nothing had ever happened. And yet, I couldn't do the same. The betrayal clung to me like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake, not just in what had happened between us, but in allowing myself to believe, even for a moment, that I was anything more than a passing distraction in her life. The next morning felt different. There was an unshakable tension in the air, something neither of us spoke about but both of us felt. She moved through the house with a forced lightness, her smile strained, her laughter hollow. I played along, pretending nothing had changed, but inside, I was unraveling. The guilt sat heavily on my chest, making every moment unbearable. Then came the unexpected call. She answered with her usual warmth, but this time, something in her expression shifted. Her voice faltered slightly before she regained control. When she hung up, she hesitated for a moment before turning to me. "He's coming back earlier than expected," she said, her voice careful, measured. Something inside me twisted. I should have been relieved. This was my chance to reset, to step away from the storm that had been brewing between us. But instead, I felt something close to panic. The illusion we'd created, the fragile world we'd built in my uncle's absence, was about to shatter. For the rest of the day, she busied herself with preparations, cleaning, arranging things, making sure the house was just as he'd left it. I watched in silence, realizing how easily she slipped back into her role. It was as if the past days had been erased, as if none of it had ever happened. That evening, she set the table with more care than usual, adjusting the plates, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles in the tablecloth. I could see the nervous energy in her movements, the way her hands trembled slightly. When my uncle arrived, he greeted her with a tired but affectionate smile. "Missed you," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She smiled back, and for a moment, I let myself believe it was real. Then his attention turned to me. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice warm, genuinely happy to see me. I forced a smile. "Good. It's been nice staying here." We sat down for dinner, and I found myself watching them closely. She played the part of the devoted wife perfectly, asking about his trip, laughing at his stories, making sure his plate was always full. It hit me then, just how easy it was for her to slip back into her life, to act like nothing had happened between us. Something inside me cracked. I'd spent days drowning in guilt, haunted by what we'd done, while she'd already buried it, locked it away like it was nothing. Just another fleeting moment in her life. Isn't it funny how some people can just move on? Like flipping a switch. Meanwhile, I'm over here picking up the pieces of a mess I didn't even know I was making. As the night went on, my uncle shared details about his work, completely oblivious to the silent war raging inside me. I could barely meet his eyes. Every kind word, every trusting glance, felt like a dagger to my chest. He'd welcomed me into his home, treated me like family, and I'd betrayed him in the worst possible way. At one point, she excused herself to get more water. Our eyes met briefly, and in that single glance, I saw everything: regret, fear, but most of all, finality. She'd already decided to move on, to forget, to pretend. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't stay here any longer. The weight of it all was suffocating, unbearable. The next morning, I told my uncle I needed to leave earlier than planned. He looked surprised but didn't question it. "Are you sure? You're always welcome here." I forced a smile. "Yeah, something came up. But thank you for everything." She stood in the background, silent, her expression unreadable. I didn't say goodbye to her. There was nothing left to say. As I stepped outside, the fresh air felt different, lighter. It was like I'd finally broken free from something I hadn't even realized was suffocating me until that very moment. A weight I hadn't known I was carrying. And with every passing second, the burden lightened. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Some things in life are better left behind, locked away in the past where they belong. The train ride home felt strangely detached, like I was floating outside my own body, watching everything unfold but not truly participating. I sat by the window, the landscape outside shifting in a blur of color, yet my mind remained eerily still, as if frozen in place. The world sped by, but it felt like I was stuck in a moment that refused to release me, no matter how much physical distance I put between myself and that house, between myself and the mess I'd just walked away from. The weight of what had happened followed me relentlessly. It pressed on my chest, a constant reminder that I wasn't as free as I'd hoped to be. I'd told myself over and over that I was just an innocent bystander in someone else's falling apart, a mere witness to the unraveling of a marriage that was already doomed. But the truth was undeniable. It wasn't just their mess. It was mine too. I'd crossed a line I should have never even approached, let alone crossed. For years, I'd prided myself on being the type of person who valued trust above all else, who would never, under any circumstance, let emotions or desires blur the line between right and wrong. I'd convinced myself that I knew exactly who I was, that I'd built a life with firm principles where I could never fall victim to the kinds of mistakes others might make. Yet, in the span of just a few days, I'd proven that belief to be completely false. It hadn't been a single defining moment. There was no instant of clarity when I realized how far I'd fallen. It had all been so gradual, so subtle, like stepping into quicksand, not realizing the depth of it until you're already too deep, and struggling only makes it worse. Each choice, each misstep, had felt so small, so insignificant at the time. But now, in the aftermath, I could see the consequences of every moment, every word spoken, every decision made. And I realized just how far I'd sunk. I thought back to my uncle, the man who'd never been anything but kind to me. He'd always been a steady presence in my life, someone I could turn to when the weight of the world felt too heavy to carry alone. His words, full of wisdom and patience, had shaped so much of who I was. He believed in the power of choice, in the idea that every decision, no matter how seemingly insignificant, contributed to the person we became. He'd spent years teaching me that integrity wasn't just about grand gestures but about the small, everyday moments when no one was watching. And yet, despite everything he'd taught me, I'd betrayed him in a way I could never take back. I'd done something that stood in direct opposition to the values he'd tried to instill in me. The very thought made my stomach twist with regret. I could try to rationalize it, tell myself that loneliness had played a part, that it had been a fleeting moment of weakness between two people who were both searching for something they'd lost. But in the end, those justifications felt hollow. Weakness, no matter how deeply felt, wasn't an excuse. Weakness didn't erase the reality of what I'd done. It didn't change the fact that I'd crossed a line that should have never been approached in the first place. I exhaled slowly and leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window, letting its biting chill ground me in the present. The guilt I felt wasn't something that would fade overnight. It wasn't something I could simply ignore or push away, no matter how much I wished I could undo the past. The truth remained. My actions had consequences, and this particular mistake would stay with me. It would linger, a quiet but persistent whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me of the moment I'd let my own desires outweigh my sense of right and wrong. But what about her? Would she be able to move on as easily as she pretended to? Would she wake up every morning beside my uncle, carrying the weight of what we'd done without a second thought? Or would it haunt her the way it haunted me, creeping into the quiet moments when she least expected it? I'd never know. And perhaps it was better that way. Some questions were meant to remain unanswered. One thing, however, was certain. I couldn't allow this mistake to define me. I'd already taken one step too far, but I still had control over the choices I made from this point forward. I could let the guilt consume me, let it pull me under until there was nothing left of the person I used to be. Or I could face it head on, learn from it, and use it as a warning, a painful but necessary reminder of what happens when you lose sight of who you are. When the train finally pulled into the station, a slow exhale left my lips, though it did little to ease the weight pressing against my chest. As I stepped onto the platform, the world around me continued as if nothing had changed. Commuters rushed past, conversations buzzed in the air, the city pulsed with life, indifferent to the storm that raged within me. Yet, despite the ordinary rhythm of the world outside, I knew with absolute certainty that something inside me had shifted. Life has a way of marking us, of carving lessons into our souls in ways we never anticipate. I'd learned the hard way that some moments, brief as they may be, can alter the course of our lives forever. A single choice made in weakness or haste doesn't simply vanish when the moment passes. It lingers, weaving itself into the fabric of who we are, shaping the way we see ourselves, the way we move forward. The weight of regret is a heavy burden, but I'd come to realize that it doesn't have to be an anchor. It can be a guide, a relentless teacher, showing us the paths we must never walk again. I couldn't go back and erase what had happened. I couldn't rewrite the choices that led me here, and I couldn't silence the echoes of the past that whispered in my mind. But what I could do, what I had to do, was make sure this moment of reckoning didn't go to waste. I could use it to forge a better version of myself, someone who understood the consequences of every decision, someone who refused to let a fleeting temptation outweigh a lifetime of integrity. You know, sometimes it's not about the mistake itself, it's about what you do after. That's where the real test begins. As I walked away from the station, the distant hum of the train fading behind me, I made a promise, not just to myself, but to the person I wanted to become. I vowed that this mistake, painful as it was, wouldn't define me. Instead, it would be the turning point, the lesson that ensured I'd never find myself in this place again. Because in the end, it wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what I chose to do next. And I chose to be better. Thank you for sticking with me until the end. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love for you to hit that button, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means everything. Thank you so much.